You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. An update on the implosion at a Longview paper mill in May that killed 11 workers. State regulators are still investigating the Nippon Dynawave Packaging plant to see what went wrong and whether the catastrophe could have been prevented. The investigation is expected to be concluded by the end of the year. It'll determine whether the facility could face penalties or even criminal charges. It will also likely face civil lawsuits on behalf of workers and families. Vanessa Waldref is a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Washington and is now a partner at the law firm Singleton Schreiber. She's representing families and workers affected by the disaster. Vanessa, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So can you first just give us a little bit of background on who you're representing and how this catastrophe has affected them?
So our firm represents individuals who were impacted by the implosion, workers, family members, and individuals who were nearby when the implosion occurred. And it's really hard to describe the trauma that is endured by individuals who have seen coworkers who every day they come into the building and work with, have lunch with, go home, know their family members are waiting to have them come home and have dinner together. And there's a toll that carries with our clients beyond a time period that most people can imagine. Some of the people I represent didn't just survive this, they actually watched the deaths occur. They watched their coworkers pass, and they were people who had trust in their workplace that they could go there and be safe and contribute to their community, contribute to their families, going back home and believing that their workplace was one that was an area that really allowed for them to contribute to their family and contribute to their community. And what often gets lost when a disaster becomes a news story and an investigation file, behind every number and fine is a person carrying something unbearable. And my clients are still very much in the process of grieving, processing trauma, and many are facing physical injuries on top of it. And part of my job in this early stages, while we're still investigating the case, is making sure that they are seen as people, not just claimants. And my central focus is bringing these families justice through accountability of those whose actions may have contributed to the horrible disaster.
What have you heard about the status of the investigation into exactly what happened at the plant? Because obviously that investigation is going to weigh heavily on what the families and what yourself do next.
Absolutely. There are several investigations that are all ongoing. The Chemical Safety Board investigation is a federal non-enforcement agency that's responsible for looking into these types of plants that have complicated chemical operations that are in situations that can have these disastrous consequences. So that's a real specialty that the Chemical Safety Board has. Those investigations often can take over a year. They've provided some updates around the timing of the investigation, and that there will be an update that they provide in the fall. I believe it's September that they will give some status update. But those are consistently long-going investigations. The results from those types of investigations are often evaluated by informal enforcement entities like EPA, Criminal Investigative Division, also for the state, the Attorney General's office. So there's that federal investigation going on. There's also state-level investigations from Labor and Industries. That's the primary agency that looks into worker safety violations in Washington state. And the Department of Ecology is also involved in looking into environmental impacts. So all of those investigations are critical to both the potential criminal or civil violations that could be assessed against the employer or other entities involved. And it also impact, but don't determine, other civil litigation efforts that can be taken by litigants for holding those responsible. So we are very, very carefully, as attorneys representing individuals, following those investigations, listening for when those results will come forward, but also doing our own, speaking with contractors, speaking with workers, speaking with family members who are very familiar with the plant, and assessing what went wrong and all of the different factors that could have caused this really, just heart-wrenching impacted on the community.
And so in terms of a timeline for any kind of civil action, you're sort of waiting to see what those investigations yield at this point, or do you have any update on what a timeline could be?
So these timelines are very difficult in these early stages of the investigation. As we learn more, we'll have greater knowledge about what is the appropriate timeline. The efforts that we would take on behalf of our clients are informed but not determined exclusively by these federal and state investigations. It is their duty to do a thorough investigation. So I don't, of course, want anything to go uncovered in that process. And I know that the state investigation looks something like assessing all of the different things that the company knows. What we have access to as civil litigators are the public records around what ecology has seen in environmental impacts in the past, what L&I has investigated in terms of prior safety violations. But what is being uncovered right now is what the plant knew. What are the internal documents that really show what the employer, what the contractors who visited the site to maintain the tank and the other operations, what all the other factors are that can go to knowledge and intent for potential criminal negligence, or all of the different potential violations that could go towards civil actions done by the state or by civil litigants trying to hold these entities accountable.
So if this does become a criminal case, I mean, could it go to federal court? Would it stay with Washington state courts? Where would it go if it becomes a criminal case?
So the Attorney General's office for the state of Washington has taken over the investigation in terms of assessing whether there could be potential criminal charges. And that's a pretty common because of their specialized expertise. County prosecutors are, very well equipped to handle a variety of crimes at the county level. But when there are specific challenge in terms of a specialized environmental damage or other deep dive that is requiring of our environmental protection unit within the AG's office, that's really their specialty area of expertise. There are also, in my time as United States Attorney, I had the great privilege of being tasked by the Attorney General to help lead national enforcement efforts. And we built Eastern Washington's Environmental Task Force. And what I really learned there is that the most effective enforcement happens when federal and state agencies coordinate, pooling resources and information to focus on repeat bad actors causing the greatest harm to community health and safety. And when that enforcement is fragmented, companies can treat a small fine here or there as just a cost of doing business. And when it's coordinated and focused, worker safety and environmental compliance stop being optional line items and start being taken more seriously. And that's what real accountability looks like, and it's what these families deserve. And so what I'm hopeful for is that these federal investigations, state investigations are all really focusing in on the same pieces of information so that the enforcement authorities, either state or federal authorities, can make the best decisions on whether or not there are the necessary elements of intent, criminal negligence, recklessness that can be assessed and determine whether criminal enforcement would be appropriate.
And just to remind people, I mean, beyond the loss of life, obviously 11 lives claimed in this tank implosion, this 900,000 gallon chemical tank that failed spilled this substance, white liquor. And the concern is that it could have had environmental impacts beyond the plant, maybe gotten into the water, the soil, things like that. Let me ask you, Vanessa, about what's happening in the federal courts right now, because it might have an impact on what happens on that side of this case. This falls under the jurisdiction of the Western District of the U.S. Attorney's Office. There was just some drama there last week where a newly appointed U.S. attorney was fired by President Trump in less than an hour. As a former U.S. attorney, can you speak to how the Trump administration's priorities and the people that it's installed at places like the Department of Justice and the EPA might affect potential federal charges here?
Well, what I can tell you from my time as a United States attorney is that federal enforcement priorities shift from administration to administration. That's true of every administration, and it affects which cases get resources and attention. Worker safety and environmental enforcement can rise or fall with these priorities. I know in my time as United States Attorney, I have the great privilege of being tasked with leading national environmental enforcement efforts, and that was a top priority. And we had the great privilege of being able to work with states where there's also a focus on worker safety and environmental protection, like Washington State. So that is common for enforcement priorities to shift. There's a lot of drama happening within the Department of Justice. And I know still there are line prosecutors who are working very hard every day to focus on assessing the elements of crimes and what cases are the appropriate ones to bring. But that's an incredibly important role. There's a lot of discretion by the United States attorneys about what cases to prioritize. And I would hope that if the federal enforcement tools were here for following up with these types of egregious events, there would be a fair look at these types of charges. These cases are often challenging, I know, in taking them, and it takes a resource commitment. And there's been also an impact from the resource allocation choices of whether or not EPA and their criminal enforcement division has the necessary resources to dig in and do all of the work that would take to bring the attention and bring the enforcement efforts to these cases. So I would hope that there's always a fair look at these types of claims, but the administrative priorities absolutely are something that is a political priority and a shift. But here's what matters for these families. The civil justice system doesn't depend on those political wins. And whatever federal prosecutors decide to do, or state prosecutors, injured workers and grieving families have their own independent path to accountability. And that path stays open regardless of who is running an agency in Washington.
Let me ask you this, because when it comes to justice in this case, I think a lot of listeners can understand the harms that families have suffered who have lost loved ones, who have lost primary breadwinners in some cases, and people who are traumatized by this incident or injured. Then there is also the reality that the Nippon Dynawave Packaging plant provides many jobs for the region. It's an economic engine for Longview. There are other employers like the wood chip suppliers that are affected by this plant's closure right now. Nippon Dynawave has said that it's paying workers through at least October 11th, even if the plant doesn't restart by then. If civil lawsuits are pursued, I guess my question is, how do you balance justice with making sure that there is still the ability for people to have jobs in the future?
Absolutely. And I understand that tension, and it is a real one. The mill is woven into the Longview economy, and many families depend on it. But I would reject the idea that justice and worker safety and jobs are opposed. They're not. Holding a facility accountable for safety failures is how you make it safer for the workers who are still walking into that facility every day. And accountability isn't about shutting a place down. It's about making sure that what happened to these workers never happens to anyone else. A safe workplace and a stable job aren't in conflict. Workers deserve both, and pursuing one shouldn't cost them the other. And that's exactly the balance that we're trying to strike.
Vanessa Waldref is a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, also a partner now at the law firm Singleton Schreiber, representing families and workers affected by the Nippon Dynawave implosion that killed 11 workers in May. Is there anything else that you want to add, Vanessa, before we go that we haven't touched on?
Thank you. I guess just one other thing I would say from experience in environmental enforcement is that the most effective enforcement I saw came when federal and state agencies work together and stay focused on the largest impact cases. And when that coordination breaks down, safety violations get treated as a cost of doing business. And my job now in representing clients and individuals who have been harmed is to make sure that doesn't happen to these families. And accountability here is real, and it is not a rounding error.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.